And welcome back, everyone, to the Living Word series, where we bring scripture to life. In today's video, we're going to focus on the breakdown or analysis of Genesis 22. There are moments in scripture that are difficult to understand, moments that force us to stop, to question, and to look deeper. Genesis chapter 22 is one of those moments. A father is told to take his beloved son, the son of promise, and offer him as a sacrifice. But what makes this story even more remarkable is what happens on that mountain. Because Genesis 22 is not only about Abraham and Isaac, it is a story about faith, it is a story about obedience, it is a story about sacrifice. And hidden within the events of this ancient story is a picture of something that would not be fully revealed for centuries. A father, a beloved son, would, a sacrifice, a substitute, and a promise. This is Genesis 22. Genesis 22 begins with three simple words. And it came to pass after these things. Those words are easy to overlook, but they are important. Because Abraham has already walked through years of uncertainty, God called him from his homeland. God promised him descendants. God promised him a son. But Abraham had to wait, and wait, and wait. Eventually, Isaac was born, the child Abraham had waited for, the child through whom God's promise would continue. And now, after all these things, God speaks to Abraham again, but this time the command is almost unimaginable. Genesis 22 tells us that God tested Abraham, not tempted him to sin, but tested him. God says, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest." Notice the way God describes Isaac, your son, your only son, the son whom you love. And then God tells Abraham to take Isaac to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Imagine hearing those words. Isaac was not simply Abraham's son. Isaac was the child of promise. God had already told Abraham that his descendants would come through Isaac. So now Abraham faces what appears to be a contradiction. God had promised Isaac, and now God was asking Abraham to give Isaac back. The question becomes, can Abraham trust God even when he cannot understand God? And then comes one of the most powerful details in the chapter. Genesis says, "And Abram rose up early in the morning. He prepared the wood. He takes 2 servants, he takes Isaac, and he begins the journey." The Bible does not record Abraham arguing with God. It doesn't tell us that Abraham understood everything. It simply tells us he went. This is an uncomfortable picture of faith. Because sometimes faith is not having every answer. Sometimes faith is trusting the one who has the answer. Abraham had no idea how God was going to resolve this. But Abraham knew something. God had made a promise, and God does not break his promises. After 3 days, Abraham sees the place from a distance, the mountain, Moriah, and Abraham tells the servants to remain behind. Then he says something very interesting. "I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." Notice his words, "we will come again." Abraham doesn't know exactly what God is going to do, but somehow Abraham believes that Isaac will return with him. The New Testament gives us insight into Abraham's faith. Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed God was even able to raise Isaac from the dead. Think about that. Abraham knew God's promise was connected to Isaac. Therefore, even if Isaac died, God could raise him again. Abraham trusted the promise more than he trusted what his eyes could see. And then Genesis gives us a detail that would become incredibly significant. Abraham takes the wood and places it upon Isaac. Isaac carries the wood up the mountain. The father carries the fire and the knife. The son carries the wood, and they walk together. Then Isaac notices something. The fire is there, the wood is there, but something is missing. The sacrifice. And Isaac asks his father, "My father, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abram answers, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." Then the Bible gives us another powerful statement. So they went, both of them together, father and son, walking towards the mountain together. They arrive at the place God has shown Abram. Abram builds an altar, he arranges the wood, and then he binds Isaac. The son of promise is placed upon the altar. And Abram reaches for the knife. This is the moment the entire journey has been leading towards. The father is prepared to give his beloved son. But then heaven speaks. The angel of the Lord calls out, "Abraham, Abraham." And Abraham answers, "Here am I." Then come to command, "Lay not thine hand upon the lad." The test is over. Isaac will not die. God never intended Abraham to complete the sacrifice. Abraham had demonstrated that he trusts God. He was willing to surrender the thing he loves most, because he trusted the one who had given it to him. And then Abraham looks up, and he sees something. A ram, caught by its horns in a thicket. The sacrifice is provided. The ram will die instead of Isaac. This is the turning point. Isaac lives, the ram dies. The ram becomes the substitute, and Abraham offers the ram as the burnt offering. Instead of his son, that word matters. Instead, one life is given in the place of another, and Abraham names that place Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Abraham had told Isaac earlier, God will provide, and now God has provided. Not merely an escape, a sacrifice, or a substitute. But there's something deeper here. Why did God choose this particular test? Why Isaac? Why a beloved son? Why a sacrifice? And why Moriah? Because Genesis 22 is not isolated from the rest of Scripture. The event on the mountain begins to form a pattern that will become clearer as the Bible unfolds. A father, a beloved son, a sacrifice, a substitute, and a promise. God will provide. Centuries later, another father would give his beloved son, and this time there would be no ram. There would be no substitute to take his place. The Gospel of John tells us, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Think about the similarities. Abraham is asked to offer his beloved son. God gives his beloved son. Isaac carries the wood. Jesus carries the cross. Isaac is taken to the place of sacrifice. Jesus is taken to Golgotha. Abraham says God will provide, and the cross, God provides the ultimate sacrifice. The comparison becomes remarkable. Isaac is the son of promise, and Jesus is the promised Messiah. Isaac carries the wood upon which he will be offered, and Jesus carries the cross upon which he will be crucified. Isaac willingly goes with his father, and Jesus willingly submitted to the Father's will. Isaac is placed upon the altar, and Jesus is placed upon the cross. But then the story separates. Isaac is spared, and a ram takes his place. Jesus is not spared. Because Jesus is the sacrifice, he is not simply the son being offered. He becomes the lamb, the substitute, the sacrifice for sin. And then there's obviously the location. Genesis tells us Abraham went to the land of Moriah. Later scripture connects Mount Moriah with Jerusalem and the location of Solomon's temple. And Jesus would later be crucified in Jerusalem at Golgotha. We should be careful here. The Bible doesn't explicitly say that Abraham stood on the exact same physical spot where Jesus was crucified. Golgotha and the mountain of Genesis 22 are not directly identified as the same location. But the connection is still remarkable. Abraham travels to Moriah, and centuries later, the story of sacrifice reaches its ultimate fulfillment in Jerusalem, the place where sacrifice could be offered. would become part of the story leading towards the sacrifice of Christ. The Old Testament begins giving us pieces of a picture long before the complete picture is revealed. There is perhaps no more important statement in Genesis 22 than this: the Lord will provide. Abram didn't know what God would provide. He simply believed that God would. And God did. The ram was already there, but Abram could not see it. Sometimes God's provision exists beyond what we can currently see. Abram climbed the mountain believing that God's promise was still true, even though everything in front of him seemed to contradict it. And when Abram reached the mountain where he had nothing left, God provided. After Abram demonstrated his faith, God repeated his promise. His descendants will be multiplied. They will be like the stars of heaven, and like the sand upon the seashore. And then God said, "And in thy seed shall all the nations of earth be blessed." That promise takes us all the way back to God's covenant with Abraham. But now we can see something Abraham himself could not fully see. The blessing would ultimately reach far beyond Abraham's immediate family. Through Abraham's seed, the nations would be blessed, and the New Testament identifies Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of that promise. But it also tells us something about the character of God. God does not take Isaac's life. Instead, God provides. And centuries later, God himself provided the final sacrifice at the cross. Jesus became the lamb, the sacrifice, the substitute, the one who would take the place of sinners. The ram died so Isaac could live, and Christ died so that we could live. And suddenly, the words spoken by Abraham on the mountain becomes even more powerful. God will provide himself a lamb. Genesis 22 is often described as a story about Isaac's faith, and it is. But notice what Abraham's faith actually looks like. Faith isn't simply believing that God exists. Faith is trusting God when circumstances don't make sense. Abraham couldn't see the solution. He couldn't understand the command. He couldn't explain how Isaac could die and God's promise could still be fulfilled. But he trusted God. And when Abraham reached the mountain, God revealed the answer. The Lord provided. Genesis 22 begins with the father being asked to surrender his beloved son. It ends with the substitute being provided. It begins with a question. Where is the sacrifice? And it ended with an answer. God will provide. Isaac walks up to the mountain carrying the wood. Centuries later, Jesus walks towards his crucifixion carrying the cross. Isaac is spared, and Jesus is not. The ram takes Isaac's place, and Jesus takes our place. Abraham names the mountain. The Lord will provide. And at the cross, God provides. Not merely a ram, not merely an animal, but his beloved son. The story of Genesis 22 was never just about one father and one son. It was about faith. It was about God's promise. It was about solution. It was about sacrifice. And perhaps most importantly, it was about God who provides. Abram could never see what was waiting for him on the mountain, but God could. And maybe this is the message Genesis 22 leaves with us today. We may not always see the provision. We may not always understand the path. We may not know how God will fulfill his promise, but the God who promises on Moriah is the same God who fulfilled his promise through Christ. The Lord will provide. Well, everyone, thank you for watching this video on the breakdown and analysis of Genesis 22. If you want to be notified of when Genesis 23 will be out, you're going to have to subscribe to this channel and also hit the bell icon so that you can get notified of when Genesis 23 is out. Remember, the next video is going to be for the Bible section, and after that one we will do the analysis of Genesis 23. I hope you guys will have a blessed week ahead, and until next time, whatever you do, keep it safe. God bless, and cheers.